Just to give me a sense, as always, how many of you have been in one of these webinars before? How many of you are familiar with me? So who's attending for the first time? If you wouldn't mind just raising a virtual hand, just to give me a sense how in depth I should go into introductions. How many of you are joining the first time? Level you are, welcome to you. And you so as well. Okay, so just a few of you are. That means most of you here have already attended a webinar. So welcome back to you guys. As those of you who are returning will know, and for those of you who are attending for the first time, my name is James Sturdy. I am a registered psychological counselor in private practice in Morningside, Durban, and I'm also part of the Regent Business School Counseling Services, where I do a lot of my work there with student counseling. I do a lot of trainings and developments as well with students and with staff. And one of the projects that we have ongoing are these webinar series that we run for the course of the year. We run them once a month. And the idea is really to cover 21st century skills that we need. So not the hardest skills, not the technical skills that you might be learning in different parts of your academic experiences. These are the softer skills that we call them. Softer, but not necessarily less important or less necessary. These are the skills for regulating ourselves and managing ourselves and motivating ourselves and dealing with interpersonal relationships and managing stress and just overall being able to orientate ourselves and our lives to a way that it's going to be serving. It's about paying attention to ourselves and paying attention to our lives and paying attention to who we are in order to live lives that are examined and intentional. That's really the focus of these webinar sessions. And as you will see today, we are talking about boundaries, boundary settings. So typically we have more people than this joining us. For some reason, the numbers are a bit low today. I suspect there is a reason for that. And normally it is a technical reason. Sometimes it's emails can go out, but I'm glad that we have you guys here today, and it's still worth pressing on. So we will do so. This is also going to be recorded, so it will be available for other people as well. So yes, I would suggest we start and then we can kind of chat as we go. Niso, you are from Swatini and Manzini, a bit sunny, but cold. Okay. Yeah, similar weather to Centurion, it seems, but brighter weather than Durbs. It's quite miserable here today. And Go, first time, welcome to you as well again. Yeah, good. Let's get going. Let's talk about boundaries. I will look at the comments as we go. So please feel free to pop anything in those comments. And if there are any questions as well, please put them in the chat. We will have time for a bit of Q&A at the end as well. But yeah, if anything's coming up as we're talking or anything that you're just relating to, feel free to put it in the chat, and I'm sure other people will respond to it as well, and I will when I get an opportunity. So boundary setting, what are we talking about, right? You might be aware of this idea of boundaries. Maybe you're hearing it for the first time, but I suspect most people probably have come into contact with the idea of personal boundaries. As with most concepts in psychology, I think there has been a huge amount of information that has been kind of accessible for the general public, which before, perhaps pre-internet, pre-social media, pre all of this digital information age that we're in, that information was a bit more kind of ring-fenced, and maybe it was the domain of the professional, right? So you'd have to go to therapy to learn about boundary setting, or you'd have to go to a talk specifically, out of your way to hear about boundaries. I think in these times, we're kind of interacting with these concepts all the time, right? Whether it's just a reel that comes up on Instagram, TikTok videos, something like that, maybe a little talk you see on YouTube. There's so much access to all of these ideas. And I think psychology has benefited from that. I think people have probably benefited from these psychological ideas as well. So we're in contact with a lot of these ideas more so than we were before. And that's why probably if you've heard about boundary setting and you haven't heard it from your therapist, you probably kind of heard it in these different spaces, and it's become these. Then people start to kind of, take it on, and then they talk about it in their personal lives, and that's how these ideas start to spread. And overall, I think that's a really good thing. I think it's a really positive thing, because a lot of these concepts, such as boundary setting, are very helpful for navigating lives. in generally speaking, but in the 21st century. So the idea here is to talk about boundaries generally speaking, and as you'll see, these are not things that we only use in one area of our lives. It's not as though you will only, kind of only need boundaries in your professional life or with your studies, and you don't need them in your personal life. These are transferable skills that are necessary in all the different domains of our lives. So we're going to be speaking about boundaries, generally speaking, in these different areas. And I guess part of boundary setting as well is also differentiating these different areas, having boundaries between work and our professional lives as well. Okay, so what are we talking about? Well, these are invisible lines, right? Boundaries most of the time are not actually physical things that we're putting between us and other people, but rather they're invisible lines, right? So they separate us from other people. They separate our needs, our feelings, our responsibilities, our obligations. They separate ourselves from the needs and obligations and responsibilities of other people. They're the things that kind of define where we end and where other people begin. And they serve as guidelines, and they serve as guidelines for how we interact with the world, but also how the world interacts with us. How much access does the world have to us? These are the boundaries that are there. And again, there are kind of these invisible demarcations that we draw. The idea is to keep the bad, as it were, out and the good in, which is to say we can be open to the things in life that are beneficial to us. And we can choose when to keep the things out that might hurt us. We can choose how to keep those up and keep those out, I should say. So these are complicated ideas. And as we kind of get through it, hopefully there'll be a bit more of an understanding, but it's only possible to keep so much of the bad out, of course. Life is difficult and hard and painful, and there's no avoiding that. But it is possible to bring on unnecessary stress and unnecessary suffering and unnecessary worry to ourselves. And boundaries, healthy boundaries, are a good way of protecting ourselves from that and not being overwhelmed. And likewise with the good, being able to open up when it's necessary, being able to be vulnerable when it's necessary. This is also a sign of a healthy boundary. So boundary is not just about kind of keeping out the bad or saying no. It's also about being able to be open to the world when the world is when it is appropriate to be trusting of whatever environment we're in, and that allows us to perhaps have better connections with people, or to be seen more, to be understood more as a result of that. If we're too rigid and we're just trying to protect ourselves, what happens is we're typically not really understood or seen, and that's quite a deep primitive human need that we have. It's quite fundamental to be seen and to be understood in our relationships, and it's quite painful when we're not. So yeah, boundaries is a really fundamental aspect of self-care. It's about well-being as well. It's the way we maintain our own identities, but also how we foster healthy relationships. Healthy relationships have healthy boundaries. And probably you will have a sense for what it's like to not have boundaries in certain places. This is something I think probably a lot of people find really hard, because it doesn't come naturally to be able to, for example, say no, or to decline to help someone when they're asking for it. This feels quite difficult to do, and there's a whole lot of reasons why that's so, and we'll get into those. But yeah, we can, if we're unable to really say no, we're just powerless in the world essentially, and then we can start to feel overwhelmed because we're just taking on so much. We can start to feel resentful because our relationships start to feel one-sided, and we can be completely drained because it's just not sustainable to be putting all of our energy. There's enough things that are going to be taking our energy that if we're unable to protect our energy, it's just going to eventually be depleted. So good boundaries are not about disconnection. Good boundaries are actually about connecting with people in a healthy way. They don't have to disconnect us, but they're there just to kind of define the differences between us and other people. And that's actually quite a healthy way of having relationships. The same, we are different people, we have different needs, we have different interests. But at the same time, it's possible for us to connect in certain ways. And that's even in the really kind of intimate relationships in our lives as well, that those principles exist. So without them, we are disempowered, because we without the capacity to set healthy boundaries in our lives, we are just dependent on the whims of other people. So we hope that people treat us well, and we hope that they are kind to us, or that we hope that they know what we want, and then they meet those needs, as opposed to us being able to have a voice and to assert ourselves and to assert our needs in relationships. And that's one way of challenging potential growth for toxicity in our relationships. So again, healthy relationships are defined by healthy boundaries. not being too rigid with boundaries, but also not having an absence of boundaries. And this allows us again to express our needs. And this is something I hear in relationship counseling a lot. It comes up often, which is this sentiment of, why should I have to ask for something? Surely if my partner loves me and they know me, they will be able to meet this need without me asking for it. And actually asking for it feels demeaning. So I see their ability to love me in their ability to understand what I need without me asking it. And that's not an unreasonable thing to ask, but it is a completely unrealistic thing often in relationships. And that if we want to have our needs met, we often have to be quite explicit and direct about communicating what those needs are. And that's quite a healthy form of boundary setting as well. Okay, so why do we need boundaries? We got into a couple of those reasons there, but just to flesh it out a bit more. So they're about protecting ourselves from being overwhelmed, stressed, or drained, protecting ourselves from too much negativity from other people as well, protecting ourselves from other people's pain. Often if you are the type of person who's empathetic, who's very able to be there for other people, there can feel like there's an obligation to just completely empathize with other people all the time when they're going through difficult situations, and that can be emotionally draining for people. You can do it for a while, maybe you can do it for a few months or years, but eventually you're going to reach the point where you just don't want to be around another person. Having healthy boundaries means you don't have to take on other people's responsibilities in that way. You can be present for them if you choose to be, and you can hold emotional space for them if you choose to be. That means you're there, you're available, you're listening, but you don't have to own the thing they're bringing. You might be having some pushback to that, and if you are, put it in the chat. You might be thinking, what does that mean? What does it look like if the world's that way? What do relationships look like? Is that not selfish? I think there are answers to all these questions if you're having them, so feel free to put them in the chat. So yeah, again, healthy relationships have healthy boundaries. That's a really important part of it. Boundaries are also about growth. If we are able to define our needs, our interests, especially in intimate relationships, this allows us then to focus on the things that we need, that we're aspiring for, and to continue growing. It's often when we don't have boundaries in intimate relationships with our husbands, our wives, our long-term partners, that we start to stagnate. Or we focus on the needs of the other person, and we don't allow ourselves to find a way of growing into who we would like to be. And it's the same in professional environments as well, in work. And the inability to set boundaries, to say, well, I actually can't take that on right now, is detrimental often to career growth, because you often end up taking on so much. And perhaps the more we take on, the more we start to be rewarded with more work. Starts becoming, taken for granted that we will continue to be able to function at that productivity level. And we actually don't get acknowledged for it in that way, and we end up burning out, becoming resentful, or leaving. Those are very common consequences of that as well. And again, this leads to resentment, right? The resentment is a sense of something here is going on that I'm unhappy with, and I don't really have a way of changing it. There's a sense of powerlessness in it. I'm angry about this. Something about it feels unfair, and I don't really know what to do about it. And boundaries are one way of addressing that, because it gives us some tools for doing some things about it. Ultimately, the best antidote for resentment is choice, to own the choices we're making, because often we're resentful for things that we do for other people, or we're resentful for what people are asking us to do, without recognizing, well, we're making choices along the way. And once we start to own those choices and say, okay, this person's asking me for something, I get to choose whether to meet that need or not. I can if I want, or I can choose not to. And if I choose to do it, well, then I can't be resentful at that person anymore, because it's the choice that I'm making. So choice is a very powerful antidote for resentment. And then improve self-esteem. There's a feedback loop between boundaries and self-esteem that works. Can work in either direction. So it looks something like, if I doubt my value, and if I feel like I'm not really deserving of saying no, these are very common dynamics. If I feel like I kind of have to justify myself in my relationships, and me being me is not enough, so I have to go the extra mile, and I have to really add value to another person's life, because I'm feeling a sense of actually inadequacy, then it's really hard to set boundaries, right? Because I feel like, well, if I say no, then I'm going to get rejected, and then people maybe are not going to want to be around me. Or if I don't, kind of go the extra mile at work, then am I really, what's going to happen then? Am I, do they need me anymore? Are they going to see my value? So I have to try really hard to compensate for that. So you can see how this lower self-esteem leads to less boundaries. And then once you have less boundaries, you start to feel worse about yourself because everyone's kind of just coming and going as they please and trampling all over you in that way. And that doesn't feel very empowering. It doesn't feel like you have a lot of autonomy or agency in that situation. And that feeds back into low self-esteem, which then feeds back into, I find it even harder to set my boundaries here. And that then eventually it's just, this is too much. I'm burning out. I can't handle it anymore. I need to run away from this. And the positive feedback loop can exist as well, which is if I'm feeling just a bit more, okay about myself and a bit more deserving, and I feel like I'm completely entitled to say no if I choose to, and I'm entitled to say yes if I choose to. It doesn't make me a good person or a bad person. It just means I'm allowed to kind of weigh up this request that's been put on me. I'm entitled to kind of weigh up how your behavior is making me feel and decide if I'm okay with it or not. And if I'm not, I can kind of say, I didn't really like that over there. That then, leads to more healthy boundaries, and more healthy boundaries then make me feel pretty good about myself. It can make me feel quite powerful, not in terms of controlling another person, but just in control of my destiny. They're not easy, but they don't make life easy necessarily, but you get to a point where you feel I'm not completely powerless. Yeah, there's options that I have, and that feels it feels like it makes me a bit bigger. And then as I feel like I have more self-worth, then I feel just a bit more comfortable setting healthy boundaries in that sense. And I think people are often a bit cautious about self-esteem and high self-esteem because it can feel like, well, where does that end? Is it narcissism? Is that I just think that I'm the most important thing in the world and I don't care about anybody else and I just take what I can need, and that's problematic in its own way. Of course, that comes with different costs. A relationship where someone is imposing their narcissistic needs all the time, it's also not going to be a healthy relationship. And that person is not actually that person will be depriving themselves of what it's like to be in a relationship that's a fair one that has agency and everyone's allowed to be themselves in it. So yeah, being able to set healthy boundaries, being able to feel a sense of self-worth is not the same as a kind of narcissistic obsession with one's needs, just to clear that out. I think that's something that we often fear might be the case. Okay. More boundaries mean more productivity. Once again, the benefit we get for being really good time managers is more work. That's typically the reward. The more we're able to manage our time, or the more we get given. So yeah, that's all very well, and it's obviously a good thing to be productive and to take on, add value in your professional spaces. That's a great thing. You're not going to progress if you don't, but also the capacity to know how much you're capable of doing, and when it doesn't feel right, or when it doesn't feel fair, when it doesn't feel like actually you can take it on, to be able to advocate for that. That is one way of enhancing productivity and not actually making yourself less productive. If you just try to take everything on and you can never say no, you will eventually find it impossible to meet even simple things. Of course, conflict resolution is really important as well. Boundaries, when people come together, they kind of clash into each other a little bit because they're different and in different relationships over an extended period of time. That's inevitable. People are going to have the different incentives. We're going to be trying to go different ways, and they're going to bump into each other. So that's just an expression of a boundary. And if we remove our boundaries and allow another person to just get their needs over time, well, then we're not going to be able to resolve those conflicts. We're not going to be able to assert ourselves. There's a time for that, of course, and this is something we speak about when we go into conflict management, but there's a time to say, this is not worth it. I'm not fighting this fight. And there's a time to say, actually, it is worth it to assert myself here because it doesn't, the way I'm checking in with myself now, this doesn't feel right. And I'm going to feel resentful tonight if I don't say something about this, or if I allow this behavior to carry on happening. Once again, energy conservation, being able to conserve our energy with boundaries, that's really important as well. That means we can invest in the things that do matter. So if we have healthy boundaries, it doesn't mean we don't care about anybody else's needs. It just means we're able to actually meet the needs of people that matter to us. So we can be a bit more, we can have more discretion. We can be more strategic about it. It builds trust as well in relationships, because if you know that if you ask me something and I'm not comfortable doing it, I'm not just going to say yes, I'm going to say no, and I'm going to do it in a way that is as much as possible considering your needs as well, and considering your being sensitive to how you would feel when I say no. So I can do that. I can say no in a kind way. But if I do that, you're going to trust me more, because you know that when I say I'm going to do something, I've chosen to do it. I'm not doing it just because I feel that I have to, and then I'm going to go talk behind your back. about how annoying you are. You're going to know I wouldn't be doing this thing unless I wanted to, and I would say no otherwise. And that authenticity builds trust in relationships, as opposed to if I'm just saying yes to everything and then you're thinking, are you really okay with this or are you not? And then, I finally have enough and I explode and I shout at you and you realize, oh, I didn't realize you had a problem with this all the time. That makes you trust me less. And then life balance, being able to not just, and this is the point I was making about the different aspects, different domains of our lives, being able to say, well, how much of my life should be dedicated to work, how much of it should be dedicated to my own pursuits, how much of it should be dedicated to fun and play, and how much of it should be dedicated to time with my intimate relationships and children. And being mindful about that allows us to then kind of define our time in a way and set these boundaries in place. And so we're not just constantly reacting to everything around us, and our lives start to get kind of drawn into places that we wouldn't be, and we're spending a lot of time and then becoming resentful that I'm doing too much of this thing. It allows us to have more agency there as well. So healthy boundaries are not just external. These are some of the boundaries we've been talking about, how to interact with people and different areas of our lives, and how to navigate interpersonal relationships. That's an external boundary. Boundaries are also internal. So am I able to say no to myself? Am I able to say yes to myself? Am I able to open myself up to good opportunities or good things, or am I not able to? Am I too rigid? Do I set rules that are too strict for myself, or do I not have enough accountability for myself? These are internal boundaries. Am I just chasing dopamine all the time? Am I constantly on these kind of social media doom scrolls? That would be an example of poor quality internal boundaries, perhaps. Do I eat too much, or do I eat the wrong stuff? Do I eat when I'm stressed? That would be internal boundaries as well. Substances, other types of dependent behaviors, these are around internal boundaries as well. So just having healthy ways of regulating ourselves and kind of staying true, allowing our present self to stay true to the general guidelines that our past self set for ourselves. What's important for what choices do I make today that my future self is going to thank me for? That's a kind of general sense of alignment there. Am I aligned with my future self, or am I acting in such a way right now that my future self is going to reap all of the negative consequences to the choices I'm making right here? That would be an example of kind of absence of healthy internal boundaries. And with all these things, it's about balance, isn't it? It's not about just being completely rigid and disciplined and uber effective and productive in the world. Life is about more than that, but it's also about not being completely hedonistic, chasing just the nearest thing that gives us gratification, because that starts to look as well like a life that's not a very rewarding life. Okay, I hope this is making sense. So there are 4 different types of boundary styles, generally speaking. These are kind of constructions, of course. Human beings are more complicated than this, and we are never just one thing and not another thing. We're a complicated mix of a whole lot of different aspects, but it's helpful to think about these 4 kind of broad categories of boundary styles, and you can kind of see which one you would generally fall into. And you might find I'm a lot of the time compliant, but sometimes I can be controlling in certain relationships. It doesn't come out in all my relationships, but yeah, in some relationships, I notice this aspect in me. You can kind of understand that we're not just, some binary black or white, but sometimes it's a little bit of both. But understanding what the broad strokes are like is a helpful way of identifying the patterns within ourselves. So the first one, compliance. This is when we find it hard to say no. So a compliant person is very focused on pleasing other people, and often this comes from early experiences of needing to please other people. So a really helpful way of understanding ourselves and understanding people generally is to understand that any behavior that we're doing in this moment right here over time, a kind of pattern of behavior, as it were, something that we do repeatedly at this current phase of our life, made sense at some other point in our life that we would do that before. So if I'm very pleasing right now, my obsession is just on pleasing people. Well, there was probably a time in my life where it was very sensible that I would be pleasing people. Maybe I lived in a home where there was a lot of violence or a lot of conflict. maybe I lived in a home where I was ignored a lot of the time, or that my parents were completely, focused on their work because things were so hard and they didn't have much time for me. And the only way I could get some attention was by just, focusing on their needs, and their needs might have been me doing really well at school. So I just became, that was the way of pleasing them. Then in adult life, I haven't lost that. I still have that deep need to please people because I've learned, well, that's how I find my value in my relationships. So yeah, it makes sense historically that these behaviors then can kind of apply. They won't make as much sense in the current situation, but they'll make a lot of sense when we look at our historic environments. And this is a big part of change generally, and often healing and growth in people is when we understand, well, the strategies that we're using now, we don't really need anymore. We needed them back then, sure, but we don't need them in the same way that we did then. So you can see this playing out in all these boundary setting styles, because ultimately it's about how we interact with people. So yeah, someone who's compliant finds it very hard to say no. They're excessively accommodating. They're very focused on the needs of other people. They're very much trying to please other people. They don't really assert their own needs and desires, or they find subversive ways of asserting them because they're afraid to ask for it or afraid to be more direct about it. Their priority is harmony and peace, even if it means they pay a price for it in terms of their inner peace. This is often a trade-off, external peace versus inner peace. If I kind of say, okay, well, the most important thing to me is external peace, I'm probably going to experience quite a lot of internal disharmony. Whereas if I'm saying, okay, well, actually, how I feel about myself and my relationships and what I say and don't say matters quite a lot to me, the consequence of that will be there will be less peace in my external life and in my external relationships. But maybe peace in that way is not all it's cracked up to be, and that it might actually be peace might not be the most important thing we should be looking for. Sometimes having a little bit of disharmony is a good way of creating a life that is serving to us as well. With all these things, it's about balance. Again, it's not about saying it has to exclusively only serve me. That's an extreme version of that. There's a healthy version of it, which is to say, I'm allowed to express what I need in my life, and then other people are allowed to express what they need. And then we can negotiate that, and we can kind of see what's reasonable and what's possible in these situations. Someone who's compliant finds it very hard to do, then they tend to just go along with the flow and then become resentful as a result of that. And they tend to feel that the relationships are one-sided and they're taken advantage of. So if this is familiar to you, this is because this is a very common boundary setting style. And the reason for that is that it's the number one, most people have probably experienced something early on in their lives that has made them more likely to be pleasing of people. And that's just a basic social need that we learn quite early on. Is it's the easiest way to get through life is to kind of please other people. You learn that very early on. And you see it as a parent as well. I'm not sure how many of you are parents, but you kind of see that in your children. You can, it's something I kind of notice myself doing unconsciously, is you start to reward your children when they're pleasing to you, and they start to learn how to be pleasing to you and sometimes how to be displeasing to you, and they press those buttons. But they start to learn as well how to be pleasing to you, and then they're kind of shaping their personalities in order to get your positive acknowledgement of it. And you can see so easily how that then starts leading to a kind of very people-pleasing attitude. There's something about that that's pro-social, which is it's good for society to have people pleasers in that, generally speaking. If everyone was very disagreeable and focused on their own needs and not the needs of other people, that wouldn't be a very cohesive society. So we've evolved to be pro-social. We've evolved to kind of perhaps be a little bit more pleasing. But with all these things, there's a balance, and we can very quickly start to get to the point where we're over-pleasing and neglecting ourselves. Bringing ourselves back into the conversation and saying, what about me, is a really helpful way of doing that. And you can do that through assertiveness training as well. Okay, so that's compliant. Also very common is the avoidant boundary setting style, which is, as the name suggests, you kind of don't want to deal with difficult conflicts, difficult feelings, so you tend to avoid them. And this is different from compliance, is that it's not about pleasing in as much as it's about just escaping. So a compliant person is just going to meet your needs all the time. An avoidant person is going to put themselves in a situation where you don't ever have to ask them anything because they're kind of invisible. They escape, they avoid it. They're more likely to withdraw emotionally. They're going to put up walls around themselves that don't really get to see in as well. And often this, like all things, comes from early on in our lives. It comes from often early painful rejecting experiences or abandonment, feelings of deep disappointment, experiences of deep disappointment as a child, is pretty devastating, and it can be very instructive in behavior. It can be very instructive in making certain types of behaviors habits, and that people go to extreme lengths to try and not avoid disappointment. Again, and one way of doing that is just not to be in deeply connected relationships, because those have the most power to hurt. Yeah, so people who are avoidant, obviously, they're going to struggle to communicate and express their emotional needs. And the idea there is also to be able to build assertiveness, but also to be able to lower the boundaries when necessary, to have the courage to be a bit more engaged with people, a bit more expressive of the needs, and not as escaping of them. Non-responsive is less common, but it is also something that we see a lot. It's just this kind of inability to engage at all in relationships. So it's quite an intense response to fear of being hurt or let down in relationships, a kind of apathy or indifference to other people's needs even. So a compliant person very focused on the needs of other people and not on themselves. A non-responsive person is completely just disengaged and disconnected, and often that's disconnected from their own emotions as well. There's this internal disconnect that exists. They don't spend a lot of time thinking about how their behavior impacts other people. They're much more focused just on, or they're not focused on it at all. They're just not paying a lot of attention to that, which means they might be less open, and obviously less empathetic as well. So there's a lack of self-awareness there, and a difficulty in actually empathizing with other people. And we're not talking about psychopathology here. We're not talking about psychopathy, which is, what's now called antisocial personality disorder, which is basically a neurological difficulty in being empathetic and feeling the full range of human feelings, and struggling to identify those feelings in other people. That's not what we're talking about when we're talking about non-responsive. This is specific boundary setting style that's often learned through environmental experiences. And then finally, controlling. This is something that you will be familiar with. And most people are better at identifying controlling behaviors in other people than we are in ourselves. But I think sometimes we put a judgment on this idea of controlling behaviors as opposed to understanding, well, it's often coming from a very understandable place. We can understand why we would do it. And often the reason is fear. We fear that when we're out of control, perhaps even of another person, that we might get hurt. And so controlling behavior starts to become entrenched. So understanding it doesn't mean I'm saying it's healthy. I'm just saying there's good reasons why we do it. And once we understand those reasons, we can then respond to it in a non-judgmental way and find ways of changing it as well. So yeah, controlling people are very demanding on the other people in their lives. And they find it hard to respect the boundaries of other people in their lives as well. They're more likely to dominate and to take responsibility for the behavior of other people. And they often use force as a way of doing that. This is why they're quite antisocial a lot of the time. Controlling people can be hard to be around. And they often you'll notice that correlates with traits such as jealousy and possessiveness. And it's often at the root of it is also insecurity as well. I'm afraid that if I don't control you, you might reject me or you might abandon me. So I have to make sure I can't trust you just to choose me. Yeah, and that person struggles with trusting other people. In a work setting, you'll see this as micromanagement a lot of the time. The struggle to actually just allow people to perform. There's a fear below that, I think, a lot of the time. And anxiety that drives that type of controlling behavior. It's very rigid. There's not a lot of flexibility. And it requires courage for someone who needs controlling dynamics in their relationships to let go of that a little bit and to just trust people to be people and not to hurt them or to leave them. So you can understand it in this square here. What do they call it? This grid. So it feels like part of this is missing. Okay, it's there. Yeah. So you either can't say no or you can't hear no. So someone who's compliant can't say no. Someone who's controlling can't hear no. If I hear no, I take it personally. That's a big aspect of controlling behavior as well. I kind of, if I ask something and you say no, so I say, why don't we watch a movie and you go no, I don't hear that as, no, you would like to do something else. I hear it as personal rejection. Oh, you think that my idea is bad, or you think that you know better than me. It becomes very personal. So someone who's compliant can't say no. Someone who's controlling can't hear no. Someone who's non-responsive can't say yes. They can't let people in, and that prevents them being connected to other people. Someone who's avoidant can't hear yes. So they don't allow themselves as well they don't allow other people to let them in as well. Okay. So some of the barriers to boundary setting, we're going to just go through one or two more slides and then I'll open it up if there are any more questions. We're kind of coming around to the end of the session. So why do we find it hard to set boundaries? Well, guilt. There are these socialized beliefs that we have of what it means to be a good person and what it means to be a nice person and a kind person. And so in doing so, we take different options off the table for ourselves. We say, well, if I'm a good person, if I'm helping everybody, if I don't help people, then I'm a bad person and I feel guilt. So we have these very rigid ways of thinking about these things that aren't very helpful. Or it's possible to be a lot more expansive about the way we understand what it means to help people and to be there for people, and not to kind of box ourselves into these very rigid, judgmental expectations. Fear as well. What happens when I say no? This person's not going to like me anymore. They're going to reject me. They're going to abandon me. They're going to think that I'm a certain way. All of that fear is a big part of it as well. And finding security in our relationships is important in order to deal with that fear. And often it's finding security in ourselves as a way of getting there. As I spoke about before, people pleasing and low self-worth, these are interconnected, correlated dynamics, phenomena, and they are we find it very hard to set healthy boundaries if our number one priority is people pleasing or if we have very low self-worth. Also difficult people, right? Boundaries at the best of times are not easy to set. It's the easiest thing to do is to not set a boundary, especially when you're trying to say no, right? So if you're in a situation where you know you should say no and it's hard to say no, obviously that's difficult. Most people don't find that easy. It takes some courage to face that because there's uncertainty and it's kind of messy. And this is then just ramped up if we're dealing with difficult people, of course, because we're dealing with difficult people. Well, then, they actually make our lives pretty painful. So it would make sense if we find it hard to set healthier boundaries with people who are making our lives harder. These are the people that we really need. The good skills, we need to be really skillful in setting people with difficult people. Setting boundaries with difficult people. Lack of practice, like most skills, it requires practice to do. And if we're out of practice, we're going to be more afraid of doing it or intimidated by the idea of it. If it's something we do more often, we tend to become better at it and it becomes less scary. Internal permissions. What am I allowed to do? Am I allowed to tell a family member, no, I'm not going to give you money? Am I allowed to? That's an internal permission. Maybe I've said, no, I'm not allowed to. Maybe if I have money, I have to help everybody in my family all the time. So we are allowed to examine these permissions that we make for ourselves and ask ourselves, are they true? Sometimes they might be true for us, sometimes they might not be. Sometimes once we take them out and examine them, we might say, actually, maybe it doesn't make sense that I have to give people in my family money all the time, every time they ask, if they are not taking responsibility for their own financial well-being. Maybe that's not a fair request, and maybe then I get to change that permission a little bit, and that opens up new opportunities and options there as well. And then not understanding, what does healthy boundary setting look like? We often think, in our most important, closest relationship, we don't need boundaries because love kind of transcends all of that. But actually the truth is those are the relationships that really need healthy boundaries, because it's so important for growth and respect and managing conflict to be able to express our different needs, even if they conflict with other people. And to be able to say to the people in our lives that are important to us and we spend the most time with, when we're not happy with a certain thing that's happening, that adds to the health of that relationship. And then we focus on over responsibility often, and we are scared of under responsibility. So we find ourselves over responsible in relationships, and that means we tend to just take responsibility for everybody around us. And what we normally find is the more responsibility we start taking from people around us, the less responsibility they start to take for themselves. And that is a very difficult experience in relationship as well. Okay, so a few tips for setting boundaries. once again, you change your underlying permissions. So the beliefs, the expectations, the rules that we have for ourselves, you don't have to just change the behavior. This is sometimes what happens. We realize, we look around, we have enough self-awareness to go, I'm not setting boundaries in this relationship right now with my wife. So I need to start setting boundaries with her. And then we kind of I set boundaries with my wife, but it still feels terrible. That's because I haven't gone to the underlying reason of why have I not been setting this boundary? What is it going on inside of me? What's the belief that I have? What am I afraid of that I haven't done it? So we can't just change it on the behavioral level. It's helpful to change it on the behavioral level. We can't just do that. We have to go below and understand what is it that actually caused this to be the case in the first place. And then we get to change that if necessary. Or maybe I don't believe that. Maybe I do think something different. Maybe I'm allowed to say this if I'm not happy. And maybe that doesn't make me a bad person. Yeah, introduce yourself into the equation. That can speak again to this fear that if I set boundaries, I become a selfish person. Because if you're introducing yourself into the equation or into the conversation, you're just bringing yourself in as well. It's an addition. It's not only exclusively your needs. So you're saying, okay, well, maybe I've been so focused on the needs of other people. Fine. Maybe I can also start paying attention to my needs whilst I'm acknowledging their needs. And then I start to weigh them up a little bit. And then I start to say, well, maybe I'm not responsible for that certain aspect, or maybe I'm responsible for meeting my needs here. So you're introducing yourself as an addition to the conversation to say, well, the things that matter to me are also worth talking about here. Practice. So the more you do it, the better you become. And you can practice in safe relationships as well. So you don't have to go to the most difficult people in your lives and suddenly, become a boundary setting maestro. It makes sense to practice in relationships that are safe. This is sometimes just, with shop attendants, for example, people who call you on teleconsultants. You can practice being kind in those situations and being assertive, which is to assert your needs whilst doing it with kindness as well. And the stakes there can often feel a little bit lower. The idea with boundaries is you're often shifting from niceness to kindness. So niceness is everything's just pretty on top and everyone's happy all the time, but no one actually says what they really want because everyone's so afraid of offending everybody. You can shift from that idea of niceness to kindness, which is I do care about you. Even if I don't know you, I care about you. You're a human being. I want to show you respect and I want to respect your dignity. But I can do that. I can also still stand up for myself in the same way. That's what kindness does. We can set really healthy boundaries with kindness. We can't really do it with niceness. And words are the tools that you use for setting these boundaries. So the better we become, and these are things we can learn. You're not set communicating the way that you are today. You can become better at it. You can become more competent. People have different IQs verbally as well. So it doesn't mean if you struggle with this, you're going to be the best communicator in the world, but you can certainly become more competent. You can become highly competent at communicating, which are the tools that we use for setting healthy boundaries. So you can think about it 4 basic steps just to close with this. So number 1, the words, the communication. I didn't really like what you said to me yesterday. It felt a bit, I was hurt by it because it felt like you weren't really paying attention to me or to what I needed in that situation. Those are the words. Consequences are not punishment. They're just saying, well, also, if you violate a boundary, something has happened here. We're not going to pretend it hasn't happened. So if I ask you, please be honest with me, and then you lie to me, well, there's a consequence to that, right? And I'm not doing it to say, well, we'll be stuck in the past. I'm going to continue reminding you of what you did, but rather to say, okay, well, actually, I trust you less than I did before you did that. And that's just what happens when you're dishonest. So there's a consequence to that. I trust you a little bit less. Or I asked you not to do it, and I said, I'll lend you money this time, and I gave you money, but you said you pay me back, and then you didn't pay me back. Well, the consequence to that is I'm not going to lend you money again. Consequences are what start to make boundaries real. So words are important, but we only really start to see them when consequences happen. And sometimes we get this wrong, and then we can do the word part, but we just carry on not enforcing the consequences, and then our behavior is actually saying something different to what our words are saying. If you're at a point where you are trying to assert your boundaries and they're not being respected, well, then you have other options like time and distance. Take some time away from a relationship, for example, to separate yourself from a certain relationship for a while. Maybe I'm not going to see you for weeks. Distance, maybe we're going to be in different spaces for a while. there's different levers we can pull here in order to make sure that the integrity of our boundaries and our space is maintained and respected there. And then people as well. People is the next step when our boundaries are not being enforced. So at work, it's kind of bringing in management or bringing in HR. In our personal lives, might be bringing the law into it. It might be a separation order. What do they call it? Blanking on it. A protection order, for example, in extreme situations, is something people are there to help you enforce boundaries. If those boundaries are not being respected, these are the kind of steps we can start escalating it to. Legal representation as well. That's a way of bringing in people to help you respect your boundaries as well. And eventually, ultimately, you get to choose, but the ultimate boundary is saying, is this person or is this situation one that I should be in or in a relationship with? And you get to make that choice. That's the ultimate boundary you can set if you feel like everything else you're doing is not working and you're not being respected in the way that you feel you need to be. Okay, so that is those are the aspects of boundary setting, just a few different ways of thinking about it, what's going on, maybe how to go about setting some boundaries. We have a couple of minutes. I know we're booked until 2, so if there are any questions, this is a good time for them. Feel free to pop them in the chat. Did it make sense? Were you with me on this? I know there's not a lot of us in this, so we'll just wait to see if there's any questions. Zola, thank you for your comments. Glad it was insightful. Hopefully you're able to build on the knowledge that you already have. I think we all have knowledge of these things because by the time you reach adulthood, you've had to learn about boundaries often the hard way. So I think everyone has knowledge on these things. It's really just about building and expanding and maybe challenging some of the things that you had taken for granted as well. Thank you, Zola. Anybody else? Any questions? Just in case someone's typing something and whilst you're doing that. Okay. Guys, thank you very much. I know it wasn't a massive group, but that doesn't actually change too much when it's digital, doesn't it? It doesn't really change your experience of, it's not like you're in an auditorium. So yeah, I'm glad you guys were able to be here today. Thank you for your participation. We're going to pick it up again in September, believe it or not. That's our next one. And we'll keep on this webinar series and chat a bit further. So yeah, thank you again for your participation and have a very good rest of your Wednesdays.